Hi AP. Today we're going to learn some principles for voice leading. We're going to start with roots that are a fifth or a fourth apart. You should know that roots that are a fifth or fourth apart have one common tone between the chords. For example, look at this two-measure phrase, and we are in the key of C. We have a 1 chord going to a 4 chord. So the 1 chord is spelled C-E-G, and the 4 chord is spelled F-A-C. And the common tone, I'll circle it, is going to be the C. And what we want to do is always retain the common tone, in other words, the C, in the same voice. As you can see, it's right here in the soprano. Then you'll need to move the other voices stepwise, and the roots of both chords should be doubled, and it's just that simple. The alto is moving stepwise from G to the nearest chord tone in the next chord, which is A. The tenors are on an E, moving stepwise to the nearest chord tone, which is an F. In the second yellow circle, we have the 5 chord going to the 1 chord. The roots are a fifth apart. The 5 chord in the key of C is G, B, D, and the 1 chord in the key of C is C, E, G. The common tone, I'll circle, is a G. And notice the common tone right here, that G, is now in the alto voice. So retain the common tone in the same voice and move the other voices stepwise, and the roots of both chords should be doubled. So sopranos are on the B, moving stepwise to the nearest chord tone, the C for the 1 chord. And the tenors are on a D, moving stepwise to the nearest chord tone of an E to resolve the final chord to a 1 chord. So that's one key principle that you need to remember. Okay, so let's take a moment to practice what we just learned with the principle. And what I'd like you to do is take out staff paper, please. Write down what you see, and then practice voice leading from the first chord to the second by supplying the other 3 voices, following the principle that we just talked about. And I'll give you some time to work on this, and then we'll reconvene in a little while to check our answers. Good luck, AP. Okay, AP, check over your answers. See how you did. So the common tone that exists between both chords in the first measure is the C, which was kept in the tenor. And then I moved the soprano and the alto voices to the nearest chord tones, up stepwise. And notice that in the second chord, the F major chord, that we have the root F doubled. In the second measure, the common tone was also the C, which was kept in the tenor. And since this was open structure, both the soprano and the alto moved stepwise upwards to the nearest chord tone. So the first measure is an example of closed structure or closed spacing, and the second measure is an example of open structure or open spacing. We're going to try another one, so please jot this down and supply the correct voice leading. And look carefully because you do have something in measure 1, looks like a figured bass symbol. And we'll check back in just a little while to see how you did. Good luck. Okay, AP, let's check over your work and see how you did. So in the first measure, if you look carefully, the common tone, well, first we should look at the bass motion. The bass moves by that of a fourth, which means there'll be one common tone. And in the second measure, the bass moves by that of a fifth, which means there'll be one common tone. So back to the first measure. The common tone between both of those chords is the C, so we kept it in the tenor in the second chord. And we moved the soprano and the alto downward to the nearest chord tone. And hopefully you remembered to put the flat next to the E because we see just a flat sign alone underneath the bass note in the figured bass. And that's a good example of closed spacing or closed structure with a doubled root of C. In the second measure, it appears as if we have an A minor triad to an E minor triad. So the bass motion is that of a fifth, A to E. So there'll be one common tone. The common tone is an E, which is going to be retained in the soprano voice, while the alto and the tenor move downward to the nearest chord tone. And we have doubled the E. Okay, I think what I want to do now is just show you what happens when you don't follow the rules, and where you can just put any old notes wherever you feel like it. So let's just see what's going to happen here. So I think what I'll do is, I've noticed I have an F, A flat, C, F triad, and here I'm going to need a C, E flat, C, E flat, G, and then a C, doubled C. So let's see, I'll just put this here, and I'll put the E flat here, like so. And then I'm missing the G. And I'll put the G right here, like this. Okay, so now because I did not follow that first principle that we talked about, if you look carefully, right here, you have broken a law, because that is parallel fifths, which is forbidden. So that's just a key example that if you don't follow the rules, then it can lead to silly mistakes, like I just made. So let's look at the second measure, and we'll try to do the same thing in the second measure. We won't follow the rules. So I'm just going to put this here. We need a G. So far I have an E, a G. So then the altos maybe can sing the E, because I need the doubled root, and then maybe I can have the tenors on the B. So I have a root, a third, and a fifth. Looks good, right? Well, not so much. Let's take a look at something here. I'm breaking multiple rules here. The first is very recognizable. In the second chord here, the rule that I've broken is the spacing. It's a spacing issue because the sopranos and the altos exceed an octave. So that's the first thing. And because of that, if you look very carefully here, I have parallel octaves. And I'm going to show you where the parallel octaves are. Right here, the A that the altos are singing with the A with the bass, and then in the same voice, the altos sing an E, and the bass sings an E. So that's parallel octaves, where you have two of the voice parts moving in octaves. They don't have to be adjacent, as in the first measure. The first measure, we had adjacent voices singing parallel fifths with the basses and the tenors. In the second measure, we have parallel octaves being performed by the alto and the bass. So the point is, you have to learn these principles, you have to learn these rules, and you should follow them so you don't make silly mistakes. Okay, so we've already gone over the first principle, where you have roots a fifth or fourth apart, that there's one common tone, and to retain the common tone in the same voice and move the other voices stepwise, and the roots of both chords should be doubled. Now we're on to our second principle. This is when you have bass motion where the roots are a second apart, or a seventh apart, but more commonly a second apart. What I mean by second and seventh, it's just the inversion of the interval. So, when you have roots a second apart, you'll notice that there's no common tone that exists. So look inside this circle in measure 1, and we have in the bass an F to a G. We're in the key of C major, so the spelling of our 4 chord would be F, A, C, and the bass moves up by that of a second to a G. And that's the 5 chord, which would be in the key of C, G, B, D. Notice I can't circle anything here because there's no common tone between those 2 chords. So what do? Well, let's find out. You move the upper voices in contrary motion to the bass, to the nearest chord tone of the next chord. And the roots of both chords should be doubled. So let's read that again and process it. You're going to move the upper voices. Remember, the upper voices are your soprano, alto, and tenor. In contrary motion, that's opposite motion to the bass. So here in the first measure, my bass is moving up from an F to a G, which means my other three voices need to move down to the nearest chord tone, like so. Let's look over here in the second example. My bass is moving up by a second, so there's no common chord tones that exist between both chords. And if my bass is moving upwards by a second, then my upper voices have to move down in contrary motion to that of the bass to the nearest chord tone. And if you look here in the first example, you have a doubled root, which is the G. And if you look here in the second example, you have a doubled root, which is a G. The first example happens to be in closed structure or close spacing, and the second example happens to be in open structure or open spacing. So let's practice our second principle. Please take out some staff paper, jot down what you see, look at the bass notes, then decide what to do, and voice lead for the upper three voices in all three measures. And we'll reconvene shortly. Good luck. AP, let's check your work. See how you did. So here in the first measure, I looked at the bass note and I realized it was moving up by a second, which means that there are no common tones between the first chord and the second chord. Since the bass is moving up by a second, I'm going to move the upper voices downward in contrary motion to that of the bass to the nearest chord tone. And you can see that I have the doubled root of an A. In the second measure, if I look at the bass moves in motion of a second downward, which means my upper three voices need to move upward in contrary motion to that of the bass to the nearest chord tone. And I've doubled the root, which is an E. In the third measure, I have bass motion moving by a second upward, which means my upper three voices need to move downward in contrary motion to that of the bass to the nearest chord tone. And I have a doubled F, which is the root. Okay, and now I'm going to show you what happens when you don't follow that principle. So, I'm looking at the first chord I need to supply, and I'm looking at an A for the root, so I need an A, C, E, A. So I'll just put this here. Maybe I'll make the tenors sing an E. That's within their range. They could certainly do that. And I have an A and E, so I need a C. Maybe the sopranos can sing it, and then maybe the altos can sing an A. All right, moving along to the second measure, I need to build an E, G, B, E triad, or chord. So let's put the soprano there. There's E, G, maybe they can sing that right there to double the root, in which case then my tenors would have to sing the B. And in the last chord, let's see, I need an F, A, C, F. So I've doubled the root. Sopranos can sing the F. Altos can sing, let's see, I'm going to put the altos here on this A, and the tenors can slide up to a C. And let me grab a ledger line and put it there like so. Okay, so now because I forgot the principle that we went over, I'm going to look carefully and see that I have many errors that I just made. In the first measure, I'm looking and I see parallel fifths right here between the bass and the tenor. If you also look, all four voices are moving in the same direction. And that's not a really good idea for your relative motion. Remember, the strongest relative motion is oblique motion or contrary motion, okay? Now I'm also looking in the measure 1, and not only do I have parallel fifths here between the bass and the tenor, but I have parallel octaves between the bass and the alto, G's to A's. So I'm breaking two rules there in measure 1. In measure 2, it's kind of obvious that you see your parallel fifths right there, F to C and E to B with the basses and the tenors. And you can see here that again, just like measure 1, I have parallel octaves between the bass and the altos, and that is forbidden. In the third measure, which voices are singing parallel octaves? Can you determine that? How about the bass and the soprano? E's to F's. And if you look at the adjacent voices right here, the basses and the tenors are singing parallel fifths. So you have lots of things that you have to really, really pay attention for and be careful. And if you remember those principles that we just learned, then you'll have very smooth voice leading and you'll be problem-free. Okay, so let's take a moment and review the two principles that we've already learned so far before we learn one more. Our first principle we learned is that when you have roots a fifth or a fourth apart, there is one common tone that exists between the chords. Retain the common tone in the same voice while moving the other voices stepwise, and the roots of both chords should be doubled. The second principle we just went over is when you have roots whose bass motion is a second apart, there will be no common tone, so you'll need to move the upper voices, that is soprano, alto, and tenor, in contrary motion to that of the bass, to the nearest chord tone of the next chord, and the roots of both chords should be doubled. On to our third principle. This is where you have roots a third apart. You'll have two common tones. For example, let's take the key of C major. The 1 chord to the 3 chord means that you have roots a third apart, because the 1 chord is C, E, G, and the 3 chord is E, G, B. So you'll have two common tones, the E and the G there. When you have two common tones that exist between chords, retain both common tones and move the remaining voice stepwise, and the roots of both chords should be doubled. Let's examine this music below. We're in the key of G major. We have a Roman numeral analysis. And what we need to do is take these two small keys over here and move them to the spots whose root is a third apart and have two common tones retained in the voice parts. Take a moment to try to find the two spots in this piece of music whose roots are a third apart and have two common tones retained in the voice parts. So I'm going to look at the bass motion, and from the first chord to the second chord, it's retained. Then I'm moving down a fourth, up a second, down a fourth, up a fourth, down a second, down a fifth, up an octave, down a third. Bingo. That's principle 3. Let me take my key, move it right here, and you can see that the bass motion is moving by that of thirds, the G to the E. In this case, it happens to be the 1 chord to the 6 chord. And if you look very carefully, when that happens, you have two common tones that exist. You have the G and you have the B in this 1 chord, and you have the B and the G in this 6 chord. And notice they retained them in the same voice. And they took the alto note and moved it to the nearest chord tone. And that was the doubled root. Let's continue on and see if we can find the one other spot where you have a root that is a third apart and have two common tones retained in the voice parts. So that's a fourth. Looks like it's right here. You have bass motion of a third. Let's bring the golden key over here. And you can see that when the bass has a motion of a third, that you'll have two common tones retained in the same voice, and the other voice will have to supply the missing chord tone. There are several oval shapes below. What can you deduce from the chords in the oval shapes? Well, let's take a look at this first orange oval shape. We have a 6 chord. It appears to be in root position because we're in the key of G. And we know that one of the rules is to double the root when in root position. But clearly the root is not doubled here. The third is doubled. And it's doubled in the soprano and alto voice. Same thing over here at the end of the first line. We have the same exact identical chord, the sixth chord, where the root E is not doubled, but the G is, the third. Take a look at this yellow oval. It's the 4 chord in the key of G. But what's missing? Well, it looks like the 5th is missing because the 3rd is doubled and the root is doubled. And how about this next chord where the fermata is? That's a minor 6th chord in the key of G. You've got an E, G, B, G. What's the error there? Well, if you said that the root is not doubled, you'd be correct. And same thing with the second to last oval. You have a doubled 3rd instead of a doubled root. And look at the 2 chord in the pink oval. You're supposed to have an A, C, E, but you've got an A, E, C. So the root, again, is not doubled. The 5th is. What's the point? Sometimes there are exceptions and irregularities to the rules, and we just kind of have to deal with it. And my guess is that there are exceptions and irregularities here because if they followed the strict guidelines, then they may perhaps be breaking an even more egregious rule, such as parallel fifths or parallel octaves. Time for more practice. Please copy this down on staff paper and look at the bass, then decide what to do and voice lead for the upper 3 voices, following the principles discussed and learned today. Good luck, AP. Check over your work, AP, see how you did. So in this particular case, in both of these examples, the bass was moving by that of a third, which means that there will be 2 common tones, which should be kept in the same voice, and the other voice should move to the nearest chord tone, or NCT. We're coming to an end of this video, so let's just review some part writing and voice leading things. Remember, part writing and voice leading is not an exact science. Allow your musical instincts to influence your decisions. Rules have been established, but all of them are tempered by practical necessities. The most important principle is to make sure that you have smooth voice leading, because smooth voice leading results when voices always move to the nearest possible chord tones. So, retain those common tones in the same voice when possible. Leaps in any of the upper voices beyond the nearest chord tone should be carefully scrutinized and provide justification by you. Use mostly seconds and thirds and occasional fourths for the upper voices. More frequent use of larger intervals is to be expected in the bass. AP, this is your homework for this evening due tomorrow. Please be prepared to share your voice leading with the class. Please copy down everything you see here on this paper. We're in the key of D minor. Put in your key signature. Write in your bass notes. Then at home, fill in the 3 upper voices adhering to the proper rules of voice leading. Provide a Roman numeral analysis below the bass line. Note in the last measure that you have a figured bass sharp symbol alone, which is a good indicator that we're using the harmonic minor form. I'm looking forward to seeing your voice leading tomorrow. And remember, it may be different for everybody because you have the ability to choose whether or not you want open structure or closed structure. But keep in mind of all of the rules that we have discussed so far, and when you are going from chord to chord, recall the principles learned in this video. So take a moment and copy this down. And have a great day, AP.